Well, last night the Pistons defeated the Charlotte Hornets 127-126, the first time in 15 matchups that the Pistons have defeated their fellow Eastern Conference team over there in Charlotte. And joining us to talk about that historic win last night after 15-game losing streak and more with the Detroit Pistons is MLive beat writer Lauren Williams. Lauren, thank you for being with us again.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate having you on. So, what were some of your key takeaways from the game last night against the Charlotte Hornets? One of the surprises, of course, was the play, especially of late, of Kelly Olynyk and the three-point shooting from the Pistons as well, and that comeback, especially the game-winning shot at the end of that game as well. This is a 15-game losing streak over the span of multiple seasons. The Pistons have been really struggling against the Hornets. What were some of your key takeaways from last night's game?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is, as you mentioned, the fact that Kelly Olynyk really turned it on Sunday night. He'd been struggling a lot since he'd come back from COVID. I mean, this is the second time, since his return in January that he scored in double figures. I mean, the last time he did that was, right when he returned in those first two games before he entered COVID protocols. But since he's returned after that, he's kind of struggled a little bit. But, he's finding his footing a little bit. He hit that game-winning shot, which we found out was his first game-winning shot in his 9-year career. But I think the other takeaway is that this was an all-around team effort. The fact that you had, at least 3 guys scoring 20 or more points. You had several players just scoring in double figures, alone. Isaiah Livers, who this was his second game in the NBA, he knocked down 2 3-pointers in the second quarter. So, you could look from top to bottom of the rotation that Coach Casey rolled out last night and see that, almost everyone had an impact on the offensive end. Defensively, they were really good. The last 2 times they played the Hornets this season, they put up 140 or more points on them. The fact that they cut them under that, I think, is progress. And it shows that this team is learning. They are developing. They still have a ways to go, but we're seeing that they have, the right foundational pieces that, can really make this a perennial champion.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're holding LaMelo Ball to under 20 points, defensively you're doing something right. Of course, I mean, you had 30 points plus for Terry Rozier and almost 30 for Miles Bridges. But as you said, great numbers for the Pistons. 4 guys in double figures, 3 of which scored 20 points or more. Of course, Sadiq Bey and Jeremy Grant, the highest scorers of those 3 over 20, 26 from Jeremy Grant, 28 from Sadiq Bey. This is just one of many pretty impressive wins over the last 10 games against some formidable opponents. Charlotte's a team that's a playoff team. You have other contenders like Cleveland that they defeated recently, the Boston Celtics as well. It seems like for those key young guys, that young core for the Pistons, particularly I'm looking at guys like Sadiq Bey and Isaiah Stewart, Bey especially, it seems like they've taken another pretty significant step forward of late, going into the All-Star break and certainly now after the All-Star break. What seems to be different with this team post-All-Star break, knowing that it's not going to be a playoff team, it's going to be a team that continues to struggle, but these young guys, really that hope is that they're taking that step forward?
Oh, absolutely. I think, Coach Casey said it best in that first practice we met with him after the All-Star break, that he wanted his team to be locked in and he wanted them to kind of understand what exactly it is and where exactly they needed to improve. And so I think one of the key things that we've seen with, as you mentioned, Sadiq Bey, he's continuing to build off of, his offensive growth and the fact that he's able to not only take shots from outside, but he also can take it to the basket and draw contact. I think one of the things that we've also seen with Isaiah Stewart that doesn't often show up on the stat sheet is his ability to set those screens. I mean, Cade has benefited from it. We've seen Corey Joseph benefited from it. We've seen just a lot of the team's guards benefit from it. Obviously, I think one of the key things that Isaiah will work on this offseason is probably his outside shooting, which Coach Casey said the team had taken a step back from just because they wanted him to focus on that day job. And I mean, he's focusing on it pretty well. So I think we're seeing that this team is paying attention to where they need to grow. And, it's only going to go up from here.
Of course, at the trade deadline, the Pistons made a really interesting move. They were able to acquire a young guy that's been struggling of late, hasn't played much this season because of conflicts with the Sacramento Kings and other issues as well. And Marvin Bagley, the third, picked up at the trade deadline. Josh Jackson, some other pieces dealt to the Sacramento Kings in exchange. And we haven't seen a whole lot of Marvin Bagley just yet, but what we have seen of him seems to be more of that Marvin Bagley of old, kind of more along the lines, not quite as impressive necessarily as you would be hoping for a guy that was a top 5 draft pick just years ago and was so impressive in the college ranks, but more along those lines than before. For Marvin himself, what in your discussions with him and your colleagues' discussions with him since he's arrived in Detroit has sort of made that change for him philosophically and just the way he feels in the locker room in Detroit with this opportunity versus the last couple of years in Sacramento?
You know, I think it's kind of one of those situations where it's a simple change of scenery. And we've seen so many times that Troy Weaver likes to take a chance on a guy who some people might consider a reclamation project. He did it with Josh Jackson. And unfortunately for Josh Jackson, that didn't work out. And now he's in Sacramento. We kind of saw it a little bit with Trey Lyles. And, you know, he ended up being a valuable piece that they could trade to the Sacramento Kings in that 4-team trade. So I think, you know, with Marvin Bagley, we're seeing him already kind of take this opportunity by the horns, so to speak. I also think the fact that this team is made up of guys who are of similar age to him. His point guard is going to be a similar age to him, if not younger. Between Killian Hayes or Cade Cunningham, those guys are both 20. So he fits the timeline that the Pistons want in terms of this rebuild. He provides them that athletic big that they've been lacking much of this season. I think with Bagley, the biggest thing that has stood out to a lot of people is his defense. And, you know, while it's not that people are saying that he's an incompetent defender, but he just has room to grow in that area. And we've seen a few flashes of it here and there. So I think Coach Casey and the fact that this team is a defensive-minded team might be the best fit for him to see that area of growth.
Yeah, we're seeing more of a return to form statistically also for him. Not playing as many minutes as he did at the height of his time in Sacramento, but still 11.5 points is his current average with the Detroit Pistons. Shooting pretty well from the field, 52.6% from the field. His three-point percentage still very low, but he wasn't much of a three-point shooter previously either. And so seeing some progress from Marvin Bagley III and knowing that for the Pistons going forward, this is an opportunity to either develop a young guy with high potential into another piece to add into that young core going forward with this rebuild, but also it's coming at a very low risk because his contract's quite favorable, even depending on what success he has throughout the rest of the year that will affect his option.
Exactly. I mean, I believe his option is $7.3 million. If he doesn't meet the criteria that's set out for him, whether that's, I think, 4,000 minutes by the end of the season or 41 games started. I mean, there are only 21 games left in this season. So we know that he's not really going to meet that criteria yet. But again, his upside is just so high. The fact that he's only 22. I think the only thing that might hurt him a little bit is his injury history. I mean, he's only played 4 games with the Pistons, and he's already out for one of those for his 5th game and with this team with an ankle injury. So time will tell if we'll see him tomorrow when they face the Wizards, when they'll really, really need him, especially with Gafford and Thomas Bryant and you know, a couple of the other bigs that they have on that team. So, you know, I think that's one thing that we're going to have to keep an eye on is that injury history and if it does have an impact on him here, as well as mentioned, whether he can get up to speed quickly defensively.
Yeah, he's only played over at least half a season or more twice in his career. His rookie season, 62 games and 43 games with Sacramento in his 3rd season. We're joined by Lauren Williams, Pistons beat writer with MLive Media Group, joining us on the MegaCast. Looking forward, still a lot of young talent on the Pistons, players playing very impressively in their roles, especially in their more starring roles, guys like Cade Cunningham, Sadiq Bey, Isaiah Stewart, we've talked about them, but those role players also down the line also being pretty impressive in their own way. Of course, we've talked numerous times about the progress of Killian Hayes and where that kind of project of a prospect for the Pistons might be going forward. But other guys down the line also that decisions are going to need to be made on pretty soon include Hamidou Diallo, who's had a very impressive season off the bench for the Pistons. Also, where do you see the future of these guys in Detroit? Where does the Pistons organization see these guys incorporated into their future, if at all?
Yeah, I think, one of the benefits of this team this year is that they have a lot of cap space going into this offseason now that Blake Griffin's contract is off of the books. It'll allow them to be a lot more competitive in terms of who they target this offseason. But I think a lot of that money might be spent on trying to retain guys like Frank Jackson and Hamidou Diallo, who, have benefited from the playing time that they get with this team. Both of them are spark plugs off the bench. They're both guys that Troy Weaver brought in. And I don't see any reason why they wouldn't want to try and keep them around, especially because they are, as I mentioned, those spark plugs off of the bench. I mean, Hamidou Diallo, we've seen him time and time again kind of help change the pace of the game, the course of the game with his just electricity when he comes off the bench. And he's a type of guy that the team wants to keep around because he doesn't care what his role on this team is. He just wants to be an impact player. And I think they're going to need guys like that, especially because they have stars in, as you mentioned, Cade Cunningham, and a rising star in Sadiq Bey.
Yeah, and right there in the same age group as a lot of those guys, too, that can grow with that core. 23 years old for Hamidou Diallo. We're joined by Lauren Williams, Pistons beat writer with M Live. Joining us on the MegaCast, of course, the Pistons destined for another lottery selection this year. Very likely going to be in the higher end of those lottery odds, top 5, certainly, potentially top 3 once again. The guys at the top of the board that are being looked at this point in time, Paolo Banchero from Duke, Jabari Smith Jr. of Auburn, and then Chet Holmgren, of course, the number 1 guy on that board at this time from Gonzaga. Other guys that are kind of down the line also that may garner some interest from the Pistons would be someone like Jaden Ivey from Purdue. Where do you see at this moment in time, given the play of the young core for this Pistons team, some of those holes that are needed in their starting lineup and in their depth as well, where do you see at this point in time the direction the Pistons are looking as we're approaching the draft lottery over the summer and then the draft?
I think just because of where they are development-wise and talent-wise, they're going to go in a similar direction that they did last season or last offseason, where they just took the best guy in the draft. They're at a point where they can't really say, I want this position or that position. I think they're just going to try and find the best person who can provide them with the versatility that they like to seek, because that's something that they prioritize. And it'll definitely affect the decisions they make going forward as to, some of the veteran guys that they keep around. But I think at the top of, or at the end of the day, they want to get somebody who is the best guy. And if that means that's Paolo or Jabari or Chet Holmgren, then that's who they're going to go for.
Yeah, best player available, often the best route available for a team that's struggling but rebuilding and has some direction and has some promise. Lauren, just another minute before we'll say goodbye today. Anything else that you're working on right now in terms of stories for the Pistons that maybe we're not hearing a whole lot about from behind the scenes that would be interesting for our audience to keep an eye on at mlive.com?
Not particularly right now, just because of, the direction that this season is. And, I think a lot of the stuff that we'll be focusing coming up is that draft content and finding out which, as you said, might be the best fit depending on where they fall, whether that's 1, 2, or 3, because of right now being the second worst team in the league. So we'll just keep an eye on that and we'll go from there.
And you can keep an eye on it with Lauren on the website at mlive.com/Pistons to read all of her articles. Lauren, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.